Coffee had gone cold by the time I finally sat down at the kitchen table that Tuesday morning. That happens a lot when you live alone. You pour yourself a cup with every intention of drinking it, and then something pulls you in another direction, and before you know it, the mug is just sitting there, a little circle of disappointment on the counter. I wasn't even supposed to go that day. My daughter had called the Sunday before, same as always. Same cheerful voice telling me everything was fine, work was busy, the kids were doing great, she'd call again soon. And I believed her, the way mothers do when they want to believe. Because she sounded fine. Because I didn't want to be that kind of mother. The kind who shows up unannounced, who hovers, who can't let her children live their own lives. I had been that kind of mother once, years ago. And my daughter had made it perfectly clear that she was an adult, that she could handle things, that I needed to trust her. And I did. I learned. I gave her space. But something was off that morning. I couldn't name it. It wasn't a vision or a dream or anything dramatic like that. It was just a feeling, the kind that settles in behind your sternum and doesn't move no matter how much you try to reason with it. I'd had that feeling once before, the night my husband went to the hospital for what turned out to be his last time. I'd learned not to dismiss it, so I poured out the cold coffee, got in my car, and drove the hour and 40 minutes to my daughter's house in Fairfax. Her name is Audrey. She's 36 years old, teaches third grade at an elementary school she's loved since her first week there, and she has 2 children, a boy named Cody who just turned 8, and a girl named Piper who is 5 and has her grandmother's stubborn streak, which everyone agrees is not entirely a compliment. Her husband's name is Joel. He works in commercial real estate, travels a good amount for work, and has always been the kind of man who fills a room. Loud laugh, big handshake, the sort of person everyone remembers meeting. I never entirely trusted him, but I kept that to myself, mostly because Audrey loved him, and my job was to support my daughter, not to plant seeds of doubt based on what I couldn't even articulate. Gut feelings aren't evidence. I knew that. I pulled into her driveway a little after 11. Joel's car wasn't there, which didn't surprise me. He traveled often enough that his absence felt normal. What wasn't normal was that Audrey's car was there. She should have been at school. I rang the doorbell twice. No answer. I tried the door and found it unlocked, which made the feeling in my chest tighten considerably. Audrey never left her door unlocked. She was particular about security in a way that sometimes bordered on anxious. I called her name as I stepped inside. The living room looked ordinary. Toys on the floor, a half-finished glass of water on the coffee table, the television off. I called her name again, louder this time, and that's when I heard it. A sound from the back hallway, faint and hoarse. I found her on the bathroom floor. She was conscious, but barely slumped against the bathtub, her face gray in a way I'd never seen on a living person, her breathing shallow and uneven. She looked up at me and said, "Mom." And the relief in her voice was so raw that it broke something open in me. I called 911 before I'd even fully processed what I was seeing. I stayed on the floor with her, held her hand, kept her talking. She said she'd woken up that morning feeling wrong, dizzy, short of breath, pain radiating up from her chest in a way she'd never felt before. She thought it was a panic attack. She'd had those before, years ago in her 20s, and she told herself it would pass. It had not passed. The paramedics arrived in 8 minutes. They loaded her onto a stretcher, and I followed the ambulance to Inova Fairfax Hospital in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached. In the emergency room, a cardiologist I'd never met used words like spontaneous coronary artery dissection and hemodynamic instability, and I sat in a plastic chair and tried to hold on to each word like it was a piece of a puzzle I was going to need later. What it meant in plain terms was that a wall of an artery near Audrey's heart had torn without warning. It happened, the doctor told me, in women more than people realized. It wasn't a typical heart attack. It was rarer, and in some ways more dangerous because it was so often missed. She'd been on the floor for nearly 3 hours before I found her. 3 hours. I sat with that number in the waiting room and let myself feel the weight of it. If I hadn't gone that morning, if I'd talked myself out of it the way I almost did, if I'd finished my cold coffee and decided not to be that kind of mother. I called her school to let them know. I called her neighbor to ask if she could pick up the kids from their after-school programs. And then I tried to call Joel. No answer. Voicemail. I left a message that was calm and clear, the way I'd learned to be in crises. Your wife is at Inova Fairfax Hospital. She was taken by ambulance this morning. Please call me back as soon as you get this. I tried again an hour later. Voicemail. I texted him. I tried again. Each time, the same result, that small clicking silence of a phone ringing somewhere unanswered. By early afternoon, Audrey had been moved out of the emergency department and into the cardiac care unit. She was stable, the nurses told me, which I understood to mean she was no longer in immediate danger of dying, though the situation was still serious. She was sedated for much of the afternoon, and I sat beside her bed and watched the monitors and thought about calling Joel again. I didn't. I waited. I told myself he was on a plane or in a meeting or somewhere with bad signal. I told myself there was an explanation. What I was really doing, if I'm honest, was delaying the moment when I'd have to consider the alternative. That evening, Audrey was lucid enough to talk. She asked about Cody and Piper first, and I told her they were with the neighbor and that I'd spoken to both of them, and she closed her eyes in relief. Then she asked about Joel. I told her I'd been trying to reach him. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I didn't expect. He said he was in Denver this week. Conference. I pulled up his LinkedIn on my phone, an old habit from years of moderate private suspicion, and the most recent post was from 2 days ago. A photo from what appeared to be a rooftop bar, tagged in Austin, Texas. He was smiling. There was a woman next to him, partially cropped out of the frame, but her hand was visible on his arm in a way that had nothing professional about it. I put my phone down and looked at my daughter in her hospital gown with the monitors beeping beside her, and I made a very specific choice about what to do with what I now knew. I said nothing about the photo. Not yet. She was recovering from a cardiac event. She needed rest. The last thing she needed was that particular grenade thrown at her bedside. I told her to sleep, and I went out to the hallway to think. Here is something I want to say clearly, because I've told this story to a few people since, and some of them act like what I did next was extreme. I am not a dramatic woman. I am 63 years old. I was an office manager for 22 years at a law firm in Northern Virginia, and before that I raised 2 children largely on my own after my first husband left. And then I spent 19 years in a genuinely good marriage to a man I loved very much who died of pancreatic cancer 4 years ago. I know what it means to hold things together quietly. I know the difference between a crisis and a tantrum. What I did carefully, and I did it with full knowledge of what I was doing. Audrey and Joel had a joint account. She had put me as an emergency contact on the account years ago after a situation where her card was compromised while she was traveling, and she hadn't been able to reach Joel, and it had been a whole thing. I had the account information. I had her authorization on file. The next morning, I called the bank. I told them that my daughter was hospitalized following a cardiac event, that she had authorized me to act on her behalf in emergencies, and that I had reason to believe there was ongoing unauthorized or suspicious spending on the account. I asked them to flag the account for review and freeze any large outgoing transactions pending her direct authorization. The woman I spoke to was professional and calm, and she walked me through the verification process. And 40 minutes later, the joint account was flagged. An hour after that, Joe called me. Not Audrey's phone, mine. He'd apparently gotten my number from somewhere, probably Audrey's contacts, and when I answered, he was not particularly pleasant about it. He asked me what I had done and why I had done it, and told me that I was overstepping in a way that was going to have consequences. I told him his wife was in the cardiac care unit at Inova Fairfax Hospital, and that she had been there since yesterday morning, and that I had called him many times. There was a silence. Then he said he hadn't seen his phone. I asked him where he was. Another silence. He said he was in Denver. I said, Joel, I saw the post, I know you're in Austin. I let that sit there between us. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just let the truth of it occupy the space it deserved. He hung up. He arrived at the hospital the following morning, which told me that wherever he had actually been, it wasn't Denver. Denver was a 4-hour flight from Dulles. Austin was 2.5. I was in the hallway outside Audrey's room when he came off the elevator. He looked tired and defensive in the way people look when they know they've been caught but haven't yet decided how to play it. He acknowledged me with a nod that was barely that. I stepped slightly to the side to let him pass and said quietly, so only he could hear, "She doesn't know about Austin yet. I made that choice for her sake, not yours." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I held his gaze without flinching. "She will need all of her strength to recover," I said. "And when she is recovered and she has all of her faculties, she will decide what she wants to know and what she wants to do. But until then, I am going to be here every day. Do you understand me?" He went inside. The next 2 weeks were not simple. Joel was attentive in that particular way people are when they're managing perception, bringing coffee, speaking softly, always where the nurses could see him being a devoted husband. Audrey responded to it the way a woman who loves someone and doesn't yet know certain things responds. With gratitude, with relief, with a kind of emotional lean that comes from having been frightened, and then finding the person you most wanted to anchor yourself to. I watched it. I held what I knew. I asked myself every day whether I was doing the right thing, and every day I came back to the same answer: she needed to heal first. The truth would keep. The kids stayed with me for most of those 2 weeks, which was the one pure good that came out of those days. Cody, who is earnest and careful and already so much like his mother it makes me ache, took it upon himself to write Audrey a get well card every single morning. Piper, who has never met an emotion she wasn't willing to say out loud, cried exactly once and then announced that she was going to be fine because Grandma was there and Grandma always fixed things. I tried to deserve that. Audrey came home after 16 days. She had follow-up appointments, a cardiac rehab schedule, a list of medications, and strict instructions about stress. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. Her artery was healing. She was one of the fortunate ones. 3 days after she came home, she found the Austin photo herself. I don't know how. I never asked. I suspect she'd had a quiet feeling too, the kind that daughters of perceptive mothers sometimes develop, and she went looking in the way that you do when part of you already knows. She called me that evening and her voice was very still, which is how I know she's in a certain kind of pain. Not crying, not yelling, just this terrible quiet. She said, "Did you know?" I told her the truth. I told her I had seen it the night she was admitted, and that I had made the decision to wait until she was physically stable, and that it was my decision and I would own it if she was angry with me for it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is that why you froze the account?" I said yes. She asked what I had found when I looked into it, and I told her what I knew and what I suspected, and then I told her she needed to speak to an attorney before she said anything further to Joel, and that I knew a good family law attorney in Fairfax who had been referred to me by a colleague years ago and had an excellent reputation. She said, "Okay, just that. Okay." But in the voice of someone who has decided something, the full picture that came out over the following months was worse in some ways than I'd imagined, and more ordinary in others. Joel had been seeing the woman in Austin. Her name was irrelevant to me then and still is, for approximately 14 months. He had used the joint account to fund several of those trips, which accounted for the discrepancies Audrey had noticed but not examined closely because she trusted him, because the account had always been sufficient, because she had been busy and tired and had a full life to manage. The freeze I had put on the account had caught a wire transfer he'd initiated the same day I called the bank. A significant sum moving toward what turned out to be a separate account she hadn't known existed. The attorneys handled the rest. It was long and it was expensive, and there were days it seemed like it would never end, but that's what those processes are. Audrey was clear-eyed through most of it in the way that people are when they've already done their grieving in private and arrived at the other side. Cody and Piper split their time between their parents' houses. It wasn't ideal. No version of this was ideal. But children are more adaptable than we fear. And Cody still writes cards for the people he loves. And Piper still says out loud exactly what she thinks. And both of them know without question that their grandmother will drive an hour and 40 minutes at a moment's notice if something feels wrong. I still have that coffee mug, the one I poured out that Tuesday morning before I got in my car. I washed it and put it back in the cabinet, and sometimes I take it out and just hold it. There's a version of that morning where I finished the coffee, where I told myself the feeling was nothing, just the anxiety of an old woman with too much time on her hands, where I decided not to be that kind of mother. I think about that version, and I feel very fortunate that I'm not in it. Audrey asked me once, about 6 months after everything, whether I regretted waiting to tell her about Austin, whether I thought she would have wanted to know sooner. It was an honest question, and she deserved an honest answer. I told her I thought that if I had told her that first night in the hospital, with her heart still healing and her body still frightened, it might have done damage that couldn't be undone. That some truths need to be received when you have enough ground beneath your feet to hold them. That it wasn't my truth to tell on my timeline. It was hers to receive when she was strong enough to decide what to do with it. She thought about that for a while. Then she said, "I think you were right." I don't know that I was entirely. Decisions made in the fog of crisis rarely are entirely right or wrong. But I know I made them with her at the center, and I know I would make the same ones again. She's doing well now. Cardiac rehab is finished. She's back in her classroom, and according to Piper, the kids in her class are very lucky to have her, which is not an objective assessment, but is probably accurate. She has a therapist she likes and a small group of friends who showed up for her in the way that real friends do, and a running route she does 3 mornings a week that her cardiologist has approved and that she says makes her feel like herself again. And on the first Tuesday of every month, she drives to my house for dinner. We eat whatever I've made. We talk about the kids, about her classroom, about the small and large things of ordinary life. Sometimes she asks me about her father, my late husband, and I tell her something I haven't told her before, because I've been saving the stories, meting them out slowly, because I want them to last. I always make sure the coffee is fresh before she arrives. I've been thinking a lot lately about the kind of quiet courage it takes to do nothing, and how much harder that sometimes is than doing something. When I found Audrey on that bathroom floor, every instinct I had was screaming, but the weeks that followed required a different kind of strength entirely, not the kind that acts fast and loud, the kind that holds still, that waits, that watches a man bring coffee to his wife's hospital bedside and says nothing, because the woman in that bed needs to heal before she can carry what she doesn't yet know. People have asked me if I regret waiting. A few have said they would have told her right away that she deserved to know, that withholding was its own kind of betrayal. I understand that position. I've sat with it. But here is what I know. When Audrey finally learned the truth, she was on her feet. She was home. She had her strength back. She could think clearly, speak to an attorney, look her children in the eye without falling apart. She could make decisions that were actually hers. And I have to believe, that matters. There's something about the choices we make under pressure that reveals who we actually are. Not who we think we are, not who we perform to be, but the real shape of us. Joel had a year and more to make different choices. Every trip he booked, every transfer he initiated, every time he told Audrey he was in Denver when he was somewhere else entirely. Those were decisions, small ones that compounded, and they produced an outcome. That's not fate, and it's not luck. That's just the simple, unglamorous math of how we live. I don't think Joel is a monster. I think he made choices that were dishonest and selfish and ultimately harmful, and that those choices had consequences he didn't fully reckon with until they arrived all at once. That's a very human thing to do. It doesn't make it right, but understanding it helps me not to carry anger that isn't mine to carry. What I keep coming back to is Audrey, The way she said okay that evening on the phone, that single word carrying so much weight. That was not a broken woman. That was a woman making a decision. She'd had her heart torn open, literally and figuratively, within the same month, and she chose to move forward with clarity rather than collapse into bitterness. I have never been more proud of her than I was in that moment, and she didn't even know I was watching. Cody still writes cards. Piper still says exactly what she thinks. They're going to be fine because they have a mother who modeled for them. Without intending to, just by surviving. What it looks like to go through something hard and come out still yourself on the other side. I think that's the only real inheritance any of us can leave our children. Not money, not advice, not the right connections or the safest path. Just the evidence that it's possible. That you can be knocked down and frightened and deceived by someone you trusted and still find your footing, still make the coffee fresh, still show up at the table. That Tuesday morning, I almost didn't go. I almost talked myself out of it. And I'm grateful every single day that I didn't, because my daughter needed me. And because it turned out I needed to be needed in exactly that way. There is something that happens when you act from the truest, quietest part of yourself. When you push past the voice that says, don't make a fuss, don't overstep, don't be that kind of mother. That voice has its place, but so does the one that says something is wrong, and you already know it, and the only question is whether you're going to listen. I listened. I went. I'm still going. Every first Tuesday of the month, with fresh coffee and a story saved up that I haven't told her yet. That's enough. That has always been enough.